Welcome to the Sociable Dog Pod, the podcast for anyone who wants to know more about the extraordinary relationship we have with our dogs and why we don't always understand each other. We'll be digging into the roots of dog behaviour so we can get to know our best friends better and make our lives with them a little richer. We'll be busting some of those sticky myths about why they do what they do, exploring how they learn, and trying to interpret their language. We'll talk science, we'll share stories, have some laughs, and make some interesting discoveries all along the way. I'm Si Wooler, and I've been working with dogs and their humans for more than 15 years. So let's talk dogs. Welcome to Series 2, and apologies that it's taken this long to get it to you. But we talked in Series 1 about how dogs learn. But in this pod, we're going to drill down a bit more into how dogs apply what they've learned and why it can sometimes seem as if training has gone into reverse gear, or at least stalled. How about you, Nina?
I've definitely stalled. So, since it's been a while, it would probably be a good idea to do us all a quick recap on how dogs learn. Just the 60-second version.
The 60-second version. I'm not sure what you're implying there, but here you have it. So in the first instance, we had how dogs learn by association. So A predicts B. Depending on how they feel about B, they develop an emotional response to A that's in accordance with that. Basically, learning by association. Classical conditioning, Pavlovian.
So basically, if I like going for a walk, B, getting the lead out, A, predicts that. So I get quite excited. Well, not me personally. Obviously, the dog gets quite excited about you taking the lead off the hook.
Yes. Does that come off my 60 seconds?
No.
Oh. Right. Learning by consequences or operant conditioning, which is if I do something, something else happens. So I can influence the outcome by my behaviour.
So I do a nice sit and I get a nice treat.
You do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Expect to see lots of nice sits.
Okay, so if we just focus for the moment on obedience behaviours, which is that learning by consequences, why is it that when we think we've got behaviours really well trained, it all seems to break down? So the brilliant downstay you've worked on goes to hell the first time you take the dog to the pub or to a cafe. The marvellous leave it doesn't work when you pop round with your dog to a friend's house for dinner. They've laid out all these nice little bowls of nibbles on the coffee table and they just get hoovered up and your leave it means nothing.
Right. Well, there are two reasons for this. The first of which is simply that the behaviour hasn't been trained thoroughly enough and tested under distraction. So you've trained it very well at home in a familiar environment. It's all quiet. There are no competing motivators. That is to say that there's nothing competing with your treat that the dog might find more interesting. And you've trained it thoroughly there, but you haven't trained it anywhere else. And you might have indeed trained at the same time every day. And you might be the only person who's trained it. And we have to remember that dogs are very good at learning specifics. They don't learn to generalise quite so well. So they don't necessarily learn that they do the thing you've asked them to do in different places at different times for different people. They have to practice that. They get a lot better at it. This is what's called generalisation. They get much better at it as they learn that that's what's expected. Generalisation is a skill, and a skill needs practicing. And that's how they develop this tendency to start performing better and better. So if you've tested them under distraction and then you take them to the cafe and you test them whether they can do it there as well, they're learning all the time that they have to do it in different contexts. And then as they get practiced at that, you'll find that they start to do it more readily out in the world.
So it sounds a little bit grinding and tedious, but you have to do that process with absolutely every behaviour, do you? Everything everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's advisable always to test behaviours on distractions and increasing levels of distraction. Whatever floats the dog's boat, whatever really looks as if it's going to be competing with your treat, and challenging them to do the behaviour despite the fact that that interesting distraction is there. You want the most difficult one last. So you want to build from easy to hard degrees of difficulty. And then over time, you should start to see that it takes less training under distraction, if you like. You train it really well and they learn that they're supposed to do it. Everywhere.
Okay, so it's not quite as bad as it initially sounds. And it's worth putting in the effort at the outset, isn't it? It's worth going through that process with the different behaviours that you really need the most, particularly these days, because we want to be able to do much more with our dogs and take them to much more distracting environments. We want to take them on train journeys, on outings. We want to go on holiday to dog-friendly hotels or dog-friendly restaurants. We might even want to take them to work. If we're taking the first steps to introducing them to the sorts of places that can be busy and buzzy, lots of new people, lots of smells, lots of sounds, and you want to make sure that that training is really solid, what would your top tips be?
Well, first of all, let me just challenge the premise that it's awful. Right, because actually training your dog is a lot of fun. I think it's important in the first instance to realise that this isn't going to be tedium and horror stories, your dog seemingly refusing to do anything that you want them to do, provided you go through the routine. Then when it comes to going out and exploring the world, I think it's very much about firstly finding out whether your dog likes it or not. Ripley's not crazy about going on trains, so we'd need to do some work about trains before you started thinking about what kind of behaviour she was going to offer you on the train so that she wasn't tripping up conductors and all of that sort of thing.
And asking to get off at the next stop.
Yes. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was hoping for more tips.
Oh, tips. Right, ask me for specifics.
Okay, so there's quite an interesting sounding new dog-friendly restaurant opened, and it sounds quite posh. What would you suggest would be the best course of action to make sure that you weren't horribly embarrassed by your dog?
Well, in the first instance, I would decide what behaviour you want, and probably the most straightforward is going to be to lie down comfortably under the table or under a chair or something like that. And so I would train to go to the place that would typically be in that specific location under the table. At home, that is, not at the restaurant. And then I would add a downstay to that so that you've got duration for the dog to be under the table. I would then introduce food to the table and make sure that they can do that while food is on the table. I would probably go to something like a cafe once I'm taking it out into the world, and if it's a dry day, do some downs outside so that you've got the dog under the table outside and there are people walking past and you're testing whether or not your dog's going to move when people are approaching the table or walking past the table and there's food on the table. So you've got a less stressful environment there. Then you could do, if the restaurant's friendly, you might want to go and talk to them about when their quiet times are and whether you can come and just sit at a table that's set off a bit and practice. And if your dog goes off or tries to trip up a waiter, then you just leave. You just make sure that you're not interfering with the day's function. And then you gradually build up to the point where you're going with your partner or a guest to the restaurant in full flight. By then the restaurant knows you, they're going to be friendly and helpful, and I would suspect that you'll romp it at that point. So build up things like, you want to think about what's the most difficult thing. So busyness tends to be difficult. People approaching tables tends to be difficult. People approaching tables with food tends to be difficult. Other dogs coming into the restaurant might be difficult. So your dog might get excited or upset about that. You want to test whether they can control that impulse to get up and go and to bark, because barking is probably the very thing that people find the most embarrassing, I would think.
Yeah. So basically, you just train it and test it in environments where you can just take it in short bites if that's not a poor analogy. So you just do it for a short duration in different circumstances and then go for the full 3-course.
Yeah, that's what I would do. Absolutely. I mean, it's very much what do you need to happen, isn't it? We'll often find that it's important as a trainer to remember that essentially you're being hired to do something. And if somebody says, all I want to be able to do is sit at the local cafe and have a coffee and my dog not drag the table down the road every time he sees another dog, then that's what we train for.
Okay. Now, we started off saying we were going to focus on learning by consequences, but what about the other part of learning by association? Do dogs find it hard to generalise there too? I'm thinking particularly about dogs that are very fearful. If they're worried about people and you manage to make positive associations with 1 or 2 people, can they generalise that to all people, or is it not that simple?
That's actually a really, really interesting question, and it's a good question. And the answer is yes and no. So the answer in the first instance is they will get used to one person, and it's perfectly reasonable to suppose that if they're capable of getting used to one, they are capable of getting used to 2. Now, that makes it sound straightforward, but that first person can take a very long time. And there might be other things involved in the mix as well, because behaviour rarely occurs in isolation. So you might have fear of noise or fear of the outside, fear of sudden movements, any amount of things that might be in the mix there with the person that you're trying to get them used to. So it might very well be that they've got to sit really still and throw food to them at whatever distance that the dog decides they want to come to before it becomes too scary. So over time you've solved the problem of them getting to know this one individual, and it's always worth bearing in mind that at some point they had to get used to you as well, especially if we're talking about a rescue dog who's not a puppy and they've come into a strange place with strange people, strange noises, strange things. Lots of things are very strange and quite scary. Some take it on board, some have coping mechanisms and seem to manage much better than others. But those that are deeply fearful, it's going to take a little bit of time. And then once they're used to the first person, you then have to get them used to a second. And that's the only point at which you know whether you're making progress, whether your dog is building resilience, if you like, and becoming less fearful of people, is whether or not it takes less time for them to get used to number 2 person than it did to get used to number 1 person. And then number 3 person, did it take less time than number 2? Number 4 less time than number 3. So are they gradually starting to see or perceive that people might actually be okay? Once you've reached a point where they are at least showing some indication, some expectation that something good is going to happen for them when a completely novel person walks in, then you can start to think in terms of that being generalized emotional response. We're not talking about generalized behavior now. We're talking about how do they feel about new people. And that's a kind of different thing, really. That's a different thing.
Okay. You mentioned puppies, and I don't want to muddy the waters of fearful and non-fearful dogs, but if you're trying to get, a dog that you can be confident about taking anywhere, is it better if you start with them very young, or actually does it not make so very much difference?
Yeah, it does. It does make a difference. There's no two ways about it. Good socialization is worth its weight in gold. So if you've got a puppy, I can't stress strongly enough how important it is to get them out into the world and be introducing them to experiences, places, noises, people, different kinds of people, tall people, short people, people with glasses, people with hats on, people that have big coats, people who speak loudly, people who don't speak loudly, so that they're building this repertoire of stuff in their life that is going to pad them for the unexpected, so that the unexpected actually becomes easy to cope with and manage. You then have, after puppyhood, there's this sort of 12 to 16 week period that is seen as a developmental period where that kind of socialization is really important. There's a bit of me suspects that it's quite a bit longer than that, and that there's a reoccurrence of that during kind of teenage months when they're adolescents, that all kinds of things can, and anybody with a teenager in this world, I'm sure, recognises the fact that there can be a lot of emotional stress involved in that period. And the dogs are no different. They're mammals. They respond in very similar ways as far as their emotional responses go, and their ability to cope and manage and find coping mechanisms so that they behave appropriately towards things. And indeed, they have the view that things that happen to them that are new are likely to be good. So it's kind of the difference between optimism and pessimism, right? So it's if you're anticipating the thing that's never happened to you to be good, then your general view of the world is the world's good. General way of thinking of the world is that the new thing is likely to be bad. You're going to struggle for well-being, and you're going to struggle for a view of the world that is positive. So that measured socialization time spent with your puppy is really, really valuable.
Yeah, so that's why both with puppies and very young dogs, every experience as far as you can, positive, meetings with other dogs, meetings with people, new environments, as far as you can, make sure it's positive.
Yes. You absolutely want to be building up tolerance and positive expectation. You want to be building up resilience to things too. So there's an interesting conversation that we might have in another podcast that's about stress, and when stress is good and when stress is bad, and all of the kind of impacts that stress can have on you, and how we need to prepare our dogs to be able to cope well with that should they need it. But that's another podcast.
Yeah. Now, there is another way that training can get knocked off course, and it's one that I am the undisputed master of, which is developing an unintended behaviour chain. Explain.
Oh, behaviour change. I love behaviour change. Behaviour change can be really great. Sports trainers who do things like flyball or agility, they're the experts in building behaviour change that they want, because they want one thing to lead to another thing, to lead to another thing, to lead to another thing, and then get paid.
And I'm not an expert in that sort of behaviour chain, am I?
You're more skilled at... I've got to be careful here now. By your own admission, I might add, very skilled at unintended behaviour chains, where you might find that, in fact, the behaviour that you want to stop increases, and people are often baffled by the fact that why is it that they're busy doing all this training to try and get this behaviour to go away, and all that's happening is that it's getting worse. Very often the reason for that is the unintended behaviour chain, which, for example, let's take the dog that jumps up at the counter in the kitchen to try and get food. And in order to stop them doing that, you tell them to get down, you get a nice sit from them, and you pay them for the sit. And then moments later, they're up at the counter again, and you get them down and you get them to do a nice sit, and you give them a treat for the nice sit. What they've actually learned is that the route to getting you to pay them is to get up at the counter so that they can do the sit and get paid. So what we really need to be doing is training that alternative behaviour, like going to a bed or doing a sit when they arrive in the kitchen, that gets them paid, but doesn't involve getting up on the counter, because otherwise you're just going to see that behaviour increase, because they've learned the sequence that gets you. One of the really interesting examples of this, which can be really difficult for people to deal with, is when you're training a really formal heel. When you train a really formal heel, you're basically feeding the dog every second or so, And then you start extending the time between the feeding moments, the payments. You start extending the time, and you penalise the failure to stay alongside by turning and going back to the beginning. And very often you might have, I've got to 30 seconds. So you're not paying until you get to 30 seconds, and they're looking up at you and they're waiting. And at 25 seconds, they break the heel. Or at 15 seconds, let's say they break the stay at 15 seconds, and you take them back, and then you pay them when you get back to the start because they're alongside you, and you pay them. So the quickest route to payment is to break the heel. They've learned that if they stop early and go back, they get paid sooner. So what has to happen really is that the 15 seconds is penalised by the walking backwards, and then you don't pay again until you get to 30 seconds. So now it's cost them 45 seconds to get paid, not 30 seconds. So if they'd stayed with you, they'd have got paid in 30. But if they break, they lose whatever time it took them to get to where they are, plus the time that takes them to go back, plus the time that you were on to begin with. So you could end up with, for example, that's 55 seconds plus of penalty for breaking that heel.
And they're totting this all up in their little
They are. They're really, really clever at doing that, dogs.
It's the same thing, isn't it? If you've got a dog that tends to dawdle and delay on a walk, and so you kind of wave treats in front of them to get them to keep going.
Yes.
That you will get more sit-down protests.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, it does depend on what the motivation behind the sit-down is, or the stall is. If the motivation behind the stall is just, I'm not sure about something on this walk, then you want to deal with that anxiety, that worry, that fear of something out on the walk. In that sense, that association learning is exactly the right thing to be doing with that. And the likelihood is that you won't end up with a behaviour change as a result of it. But, however, if your dog isn't upset and has worked out that the way to get you to give him a treaty is to stop and then start again, then they're going to do an awful lot of stopping in order to start. And that can be really, really frustrating for people.
Yeah, absolutely. We make light of the difficulties when training doesn't seem to stick, but it's not actually always a laughing matter. It can be really, really frustrating for people. And I think sometimes we as humans take it awfully personally and think that our dog is either being defiant or being difficult out of spite, but it's not so, is it?
No, absolutely not. They're just working, they're either working the system or they're worried about something. They're not thinking, well, I'm going to get my own back for X, Y, Z that happened 4 days ago, or I can be awkward because it's funny and it's going to really wind them up. It's just dogs do what works. It's a profit and loss spreadsheet for them as far as behaviour that's about consequences, that's about gaining something that's in their interest. And as far as upset behaviour is concerned, it's about avoidance, either escape or avoidance of something that they find unpleasant.
Okay. So there we are. We have dug deep into the murky depths of why good training can seem to just sink when we need it most. What are you going to talk about next week? Because I'm going back into the cupboard because you have a guest, do you not?
I do have a guest. We're going to be talking to Jean Donaldson, who is my teacher and mentor from the States in California, who runs the Academy for Dog Training. And we're going to be talking about all things educational, so how important it is for trainers to get a good education so that they understand the science and the principle behind training. We're going to be talking about the worries around aversive training and what's happening about regulation and whether or not we need legislation to protect consumers and dogs. Oh, we're going to cover all sorts of things.
Jolly good.
Yes. And we'll hopefully see everybody there. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye-bye.